As women, we need to keep raising our voices, keep the pressure on. Reach out to your MP and tell them you want to see change here. Have that conversation in your workplace. Talk about your symptoms and your experiences with your friends, with your partner. Let's break down this stigma together.
Welcome to Thriving in Menopause, brought to you by Prevention Magazine. I'm Zoe Mernier, the editor of Prevention. Thank you for joining me for episode 4 of season 11. Today on the podcast, we're very excited to be joined by Senator Marielle Smith. Senator Smith is a South Australian senator and the deputy chair and co-sponsor of the Senate Community Affairs Committee's inquiry into menopause. Now, this Senate inquiry spanned 9 months, during which time the committee heard from 300 Australian women who were keen to share their experiences of menopause and perimenopause. The final report was tabled in September. Senator Smith was someone who was passionate that this inquiry needed to take place and was really instrumental in making it happen, so we're thrilled that she is with us today to share the findings. Senator Smith, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Zoe.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how the inquiry came about.
Yes, so the inquiry was sponsored by myself and another senator, Larissa Waters, to the Senate. And we did so because we wanted to use the spotlight we have in the Senate to shine a light on issues surrounding perimenopause and menopause, because we were hearing too often for women that when it came to their healthcare and when it came to their experience in work, they just weren't getting the support that they needed.
Yeah, for sure. So were you surprised by just how big the response was to the requests for submissions of women's experiences?
Look, I expected there to be a lot of interest, but even I was surprised by how many women reached out, wrote to us, made submissions and came to present to us. And I think that's because not just in perimenopause and menopause, but across a woman's health journey, too often we don't feel heard, we don't feel listened to, and because of that, we don't feel like we get the care we need.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what was the overriding sense that you felt when you heard these stories of the women who came forward? Like, what were these women telling you?
Well, very often women told us that when they sought out help from a medical practitioner, often those conversations didn't go very well. They felt like when they shared their experiences of pain, that was dismissed. Often their symptoms were talked about as being just part of midlife and the stressful time that all women go through. And they also said that when they asked their doctors for help, often they felt like they didn't have up-to-date information on treatments like HRT, or that they just weren't really ready or willing to engage in a conversation about perimenopause in particular. And some women had really upsetting stories. You know, they presented to us through tears because they were going through something really difficult in their life, seeking support and just feeling like they weren't being heard.
And were they really across the board of Australia where these stories were coming from? That was pretty universal?
Right across Australia, women were telling us this. And I think in regional and rural areas, though, women told us they had a similar experience to women in the city, but it was compounded because if you're a woman in the city and you have that experience with your GP, you might have an opportunity to shop around, to ask a girlfriend if she's got a good GP, to look online and see who might be a specialist. But if you're living in a more remote part of Australia, there may only be one GP in town. So for those women, there were definitely some extra challenges.
For sure. Now, what to you was the biggest issue that you saw in the way that menopause is being treated currently?
Well, I think the biggest issue is this concern around women not feeling heard and like they can have a conversation and get good quality advice and information. And that was shared with us by GPs too. I mean, GPs told us that they felt underprepared after university to treat their patients with symptoms of menopause and that they wanted more information. They wanted more professional development to be able to support women at this point of their lives, but just weren't able to get it. And I think that's, a really terrible state of affairs. Menopause isn't an optional part of ageing. Every single woman who reaches midlife will experience menopause. And while she may not experience it in the same way to her mother or a sister or her friend, it's very likely that she will need some kind of support, some kind of conversation, or at least good quality information to help guide her through this part of life.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's get on to these fascinating recommendations that you have made, and it's very exciting when you read through them all and just think, wow, if all these came to fruition, what a wonderful place it would be. So, well, can you give us a bit of an overview or summary of the recommendations? So, I mean, there's 25 of them altogether. We'll go through the few of them in detail, but give us a bit of an overview.
So we made recommendations focused on 3 key areas. So the first was healthcare. And as I said, menopause isn't an optional part of ageing. Good quality primary healthcare should not be optional either. So we made a number of recommendations which went to lifting the standards of education of trainee medical students. We've asked the medical deans to look at what they can do in their curriculums when they're teaching students to make sure they're better equipped as soon as they enter the workforce as a GP to support women. We've also made recommendations which go to a woman's experience in the workplace. And whilst many, many women go through this period of life without any impact on their work, we know for some women who have really troubling symptoms, it can affect their ability to go for that next promotion or to stay at their workplace. They might want to take time off to manage their symptoms. They may feel like stepping up for that next opportunity is just a bit hard whilst they're managing and working out how to manage those symptoms. And we absolutely don't want to see this happen. We're talking about women at the absolute prime of their lives and in the peak of their careers. These are the women we should be most concerned with keeping in the workforce, keeping connected, making sure they continue to thrive. And women told us overwhelmingly it was little things which could make a big difference. So small changes at work, like a desk fan at your desk, or perhaps a slightly later start date if you've had a really rubbish night's sleep. It might be the ability to travel to work outside of peak hour, so you're not on a stuffy, overcrowded train. You can travel a bit more comfortably if hot flushes are something you're dealing with, or maybe a breathable uniform. But not big changes for an employer to make. But for an employee with troubling symptoms, that could be the difference between her staying at work and not. And then finally, we made recommendations which look at the stigma which surrounds these issues, because we know that the stigma around perimenopause and menopause is stopping good conversations happening in workplaces about what needs to change. It's stopping women getting good quality advice and help. And we just can't let that keep happening. We need to be talking about women's health issues. There's no shame in something which will affect every single woman at the peak and prime of her life.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that kind of goes to that very first recommendation that you've made, which is that the Australian government launch a national menopause and perimenopause awareness campaign. Do you think that is sort of so important because of that stigma and just to absolutely sort of normalise it, I guess?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we're having a national conversation about menopause at the moment. I'd like to see that national conversation backed up with really good quality information resources and public communications. And that's not just about women, it's also about their partners, it's about their doctors, and it's about their workplaces. We had husbands come and present to us as a committee to tell us that, they could see their wife was struggling, but they just didn't know what was going on. They did not know how to support her, and they just wanted some more information so that they could be a good partner and a good supporter. We had women tell us that it took just ages for them to work out it was menopause that was causing their symptoms. And, it was only after a conversation with a few friends that someone pointed them to a checklist, or they joined a Facebook site and went, oh, okay, I get it. It clicks now. This is what's going on in my life. And we also heard from employers who said, well, yeah, I want to be a good employer. I don't want to lose these amazing women from my workplace, but what do I do? Tell me what I need to know. Tell me what I need to understand. So having good public information out there, I think, can be empowering for all of us. And I also think it will make a difference. We want women to get good information, to have that easily accessible. And we need this stigma just stripped away, because you don't change things and you don't change issues if they're kept in the dark.
For sure. Yeah, we don't want women having to stumble over the fact that they're going through menopause and then have to search for these answers. And I mean, I love the way that in one of your recommendations, it's basically removing the stigma from the ground up, and that's by working it into the Australian curriculum in schools as well.
Yes, and look, I think this is really important because, I mean, as a woman, too often it feels like when you're taught about your healthcare journey, you're taught that you'll go through puberty and that will really suck. It'll be a pretty miserable time, but you'll come out the other end of it. And then you're taught that one day you'll probably have a baby, and that will really, really hurt. But then that's sort of it, like nothing of consequence happens in a woman's life or to a woman's health journey after she gives birth. And it is just completely nonsense. Every single woman will experience menopause. Yes, she'll experience it differently, but she will experience it. And we need to be having that conversation and talking about that right from the beginning when we're learning about a woman's body, when we're learning about the changes in life. And we know, if we're not talking about these things, if you're going into experiences of life, whether it's menopause and perimenopause or things like breastfeeding, and you're not prepared for the challenges you might face or the discomfort or pain or any of those things, they really can be really hard to deal with and really hard to get further support. But if we talk about them, if we know what's happening, what's coming, and we also help tackle that stigma really, really early, I think that's going to be very powerful. And I also say, I see all the time when I'm dealing with younger Australians in my work, particularly Gen Z Australians, they're really comfortable talking about their health. They're really comfortable talking about periods and menstruation and sexual health. They're treating these issues in a much more open way with stigma released from them. But we need to make sure they're also learning about what's happening later and what's coming down the track. And as older women, feeling comfortable to have those conversations too.
For sure. We'll be right back after this.
Perimenopause can actually start in your 40s. Declining estrogen production during perimenopause brings on changes to menstrual cycles and often the onset of hot flushes, night sweats, mood swings, and sexual problems. Promensal Peri is specifically designed for perimenopausal women and can help relieve these common menopausal symptoms. Promensal Peri is available at leading pharmacies across Australia and offers a cost-effective treatment at under $1 a day. When things start to change, try Promensal Peri. Always read the label and follow the directions for use.
Okay, we're back. Now, yes, as you said, probably the biggest amount of recommendations are all about the education of GPs and the greater medical community. Obviously, you were seeing evidence of some real issues in this regard, as to women sort of really feeling a bit unheard and I think to a degree dismissed as well, about a lot of their symptoms. Was that your experience?
It really was, and I had one woman present to us who talked about having a diagnosis for cancer, and when she was given that diagnosis, she was also told that she would likely go through menopause early, and her doctor made jokes about it. It was a joke that her husband would probably go through a pretty rough time as a result, rather than a conversation about what was going to happen, what all this meant, what it would mean for her body, what she should look out for. But we just had so many stories like that from women who just went to doctor after doctor trying to find someone who they felt heard them, they felt saw them, and who recognised that their pain was real and that they needed help, or that their symptoms were impacting them and they just needed a bit of help. And we need to make sure we're listening to women, all women across all phases of their life. Too often women's pain gets ignored or dismissed, and that's not a tenable situation. It's just not tenable. Women deserve to be heard, and we need to raise our voices together and demand a better quality of care.
Yeah. So, as you said, a lot of the GPs were saying also that they felt that they didn't have enough education. So obviously educating GPs from the get-go is a huge thing. But what were some of the other important recommendations the inquiry felt needed to be made in regards to GPs?
Yeah, so looking at their education, but also looking at opportunities for professional development too. So the federal government recently funded $1.2 million in professional development for GPs, but we need to make sure those sorts of resources are really accessible, and that when a GP is seeking to upskill in menopause and perimenopause, they've got good quality information too. There's some amazing GPs right across Australia who are specialists in women's health. I don't want it to sound like no GP in Australia is ready and able and helping women in this regard. But we do know if this is missing in the basic education that GPs are getting, they're not going to feel equipped to support women at this stage of life. And we need to be clear, this is not something which might happen to one of your patients. This will happen to every woman in your sleep. So you better be prepared to help her and to be able to support her if she needs you to.
Yes, absolutely. One of the issues that came about was, I think, GPs feeling like time was a factor as well, wasn't it? When they're meeting with a patient who might have multi symptoms, and quite a complex thing that they've got to go through. So one of the recommendations was to address that, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. And the government has done a lot of work to fund extended consultations at different points in life. But we did, as a committee, think there's value in a longer health check for women experiencing perimenopause and menopause. And we've asked the government to look at its existing MBS item numbers to see if that's possible to include. And that's because we want to make sure when a woman reaches out and seeks help from her GP, there's actually time to have that conversation, time to understand what might be going on in her life, time to commission tests if that's what's required, and time to really talk through what the treatment options are, including the more modern treatment options. Women tell us they feel kind of ticked and flicked through the GP appointment, and because of that they're not necessarily feeling fully heard. So we did make some recommendations around that, which I hope the government is able to look into.
And now going back to the menopause in the workplace, can you share some of the stories you heard from women regarding their experiences and a bit more of an overview of some of the changes you want to see made here? I mean, you mentioned those smaller things that will make that can make all the difference, but anything else there?
Yeah, I think overwhelmingly what women told us is flexibility is key here, that women want to stay connected to the workplace. They don't want to be sent out of the workplace because they can't get the simple adjustments they need to keep thriving. For office workers, that does look like things like desk fans or maybe flexible start dates, or the ability to work from home. It's a different challenge, though, for women in environments like the factory floor or women who work on a checkout or in a childcare centre, because those sorts of adjustments aren't going to be possible for them. And that's why we've asked workplaces to sit down with their employees and have a conversation about what flexibility might mean in your workplace, what the women in your workplace might be seeking in terms of support. And to underpin these conversations, we think it's worth the government looking into the right to request flexibility. So you have that right to request flexibility for other things like your caring responsibilities. I think perimenopause and menopause should be included in that. Ideally, all these conversations would happen at a workplace level, but having that support from the federal government and in those frameworks, I think, could be really powerful and important too.
Absolutely. And were there any recommendations that we haven't sort of specifically pinpointed that you particularly wanted to mention?
Look, I will say another thing that women told us is that, if they had an experience where they sought advice from their GP and didn't feel like they were heard or they felt like they were dismissed, then they went online and they couldn't find good quality information or didn't know which information was of high quality. Often they turned to social media for support. And there's some really good peer support on social media. And we heard about a Facebook group in particular, which was really making a big difference to women's lives. But we also know on social media you get a lot of advertising, which is pretty targeted. And women were telling us that they were getting bombarded with advertisements for different products which offered a quick and easy fix for their symptoms. And that's really concerning because whilst there may be quality products being offered, a lot of this is junk and a lot of it won't make a difference in a woman's life. So we have asked the TGA to look into this, to look at the way they monitor these kinds of practices, look at their labelling. And I don't know if we'll see change there from the TGA, but I think it's something they need to be aware of and taking some action on, because we don't want women feeling desperate, feeling like they're turning to these products and doing more harm than good. But also we need to change that and stop that at the start by making sure that when a woman does seek out information, that's easily accessible to her. When she seeks out support for her symptoms, she has access to good quality treatments, because we are all vulnerable to that scrolling when you're looking for a quick solution and a quick fix, but it just might be doing.
Yeah, they do make it sound like it's the must-have thing that you can't do without. So we've all fallen prey to that one.
Absolutely. Normally at 11 o'clock at night.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so now that the recommendations have been made, what's next? Like, how hopeful are you that we might soon actually see some significant change in the way menopause is treated in Australia?
Well, I'm both hopeful and prepared to fight for it. So I think, we deliberately made recommendations to a broader group than government. Some of this will require government action, but a lot of it needs to change at a community level. We need to change this in workplaces. We need to change this in the medical profession. We need to change it in schools. And that requires collective action from all of us, because there's not one single thing the government can do to fix some of the problems we're seeing here, but I do think the government can take a leadership role. So I'll be using my sharpest elbows amongst my colleagues to try and get some change here, but also continuing to have this national conversation. As women, we need to keep raising our voices, keep the pressure on. Reach out to your MP and tell them you want to see change here. Have that conversation in your workplace. Talk about your symptoms and your experiences with your friends, with your partner. Let's break down this stigma together, keep this pressure high, because that's the way we'll see change.
Well, thank you so much for all the championing that you have done on our behalf. But yes, absolutely, we all do need to take up the mantle as well. Look, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. But thank you so much, Senator Smith, for sharing your time and insights with us.
Thank you, Zoe. It's really lovely to chat, and thanks for your interest.
Okay. And listeners, thank you for joining us as well. If you liked this episode, we'd love you to rate, review and subscribe. And we hope you'll join us for next week's episode. Meanwhile, for more information about living your best life at midlife, pick up a copy of Prevention magazine. I'm Zoe Mernier. See you next time.